The heavy click of the studio door unlatching cut the silence like a snapped cable. I froze, the thick, cream-colored stationery trembling in my grip. The scent of the paper, expensive, laced with her perfume, mixed with the sudden, sharp spike of my own adrenaline. I didn't have time to slide the letters back. I didn't have time to breathe. The silhouette in the doorway wasn't the night security guard making his rounds. It was the silhouette I had spent 2 years memorizing. It was Eloise. And she was looking right at the evidence in my hands. 30 minutes earlier, the firm of Sterling and Vance didn't feel like a trap. It felt like a cathedral of glass and polished concrete, suspended above the city grid. The air conditioning hummed with a low, industrial vibration that you felt in your teeth more than you heard with your ears. Most nights, I was the only one left to feel it. The junior associates usually filtered out by 7, their ambition capped by the desire for a social life. The partners left by 8, confident that their legacy was being polished by hands like mine. But I stayed. I stayed because the silence of the studio was the only place where I could almost think clearly. And because I knew that somewhere in the city, Eloise was likely still awake, still thinking, still refining the lines of the world until they bled perfection. Eloise. Even thinking her name felt like a violation of protocol. She was less a boss and more a force of nature contained within the sharp tailoring of a charcoal suit. In the 2 years I had served as her senior associate, I had never seen her hair out of place, never seen her hesitate, and never heard her raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her silence was a structural element, heavy enough to crush you if you weren't bearing the load correctly. She was exacting in a way that made perfectionism look lazy. A missing comma in a brief warranted a slow, disappointed blink. A misalignment in a render earned a quiet suggestion that perhaps architecture wasn't your true calling. She was brilliant, cold, and utterly untouchable, and I was the one who ran toward the fire. I told myself it was professional respect. I told myself I was staying late to match her impossible standards because I wanted her career, her accolades, her ability to look at a void and see a structure. I became the ghost in her machine, the one who anticipated the coffee order before she asked, the one who had the zoning laws memorized before the client meeting, the one who ensured the foundation of her day never developed a crack. It was a rigorous, exhausting devotion. I convinced myself it was about the work. It is easy to lie to yourself when the lie comes with a paycheck and the occasional, rare nod of approval that feels like a sun flare in winter. The atmosphere of the studio at night amplified this delusion. The city lights of Chicago blurred into streaks of amber and white below the floor-to-ceiling windows. A distant, chaotic world that felt miles away from the sterile precision of the 42nd floor. Here, everything was controlled. Every pencil was aligned. Every model was covered. I was just a small, moving part in Eloise's grand design, a mechanism that kept the engine running. But tonight, the mechanism had failed. The deadline for the Ocular Museum pitch was 8 hours away. The servers had synced, the renders were finalized, and the physical models were staged in the conference room. It was done. Except for the client profile, the physical dossier Eloise insisted on reviewing manually before every major pitch. It wasn't on her assistant's desk. It wasn't in the staging area. It had to be in her office. Entering Eloise's private office without her presence was technically allowed for a senior associate, but it felt like trespassing. It felt like walking into the Holy of Holies without washing your hands. I stood outside her frosted glass door for a long minute, the hum of the server room vibrating against the soles of my shoes. I knew the code. I knew the protocol. I just didn't know that opening that door would dismantle the careful architecture of the last 2 years. I punched in the code, the keypad beeping softly, and pushed the handle down. The door swung open into the dark, smelling of sandalwood and the sharp, bitter edge of espresso. I stepped inside to find a file, unaware I was about to find myself. The room breathed a different kind of silence than the rest of the studio. Out on the floor, the silence was empty, waiting to be filled with work. In here, the silence was heavy, curated, smelling of sandalwood and the dark, oily roast of espresso beans she ground herself every morning. It was a scent I associated with terror and approval in equal measure. The space was terrifyingly orderly. Her desk wasn't just a workspace. It was a statement of intent. A slab of black marble, cool to the touch, with nothing on it but a sleek monitor and a single, perfect fountain pen. No loose papers, no family photos, no cracks in the facade. It felt less like an office and more like an operating theater, where ideas were dissected and reassembled. I moved around the desk, my footsteps swallowed by the plush charcoal rug. I needed the client profile. Logic dictated it would be in the pending tray on the credenza behind her chair. I reached for the stack of leather-bound binders, the ones holding the project archives. My hand was steady. I was a professional. This was a task, nothing more. But the air in here felt charged, pressurized. As I pulled the ocular file, the heavy binder clipped the edge of a stack of architectural monographs I hadn't noticed in the shadows. The crash wasn't loud, but in that hermetically sealed room, it sounded like a structural failure. The books slid sideways, fanning out across the credenza. I lunged to catch them, my pulse spiking, terrified of leaving a trace of my clumsiness. I righted the books, my hands shaking slightly, and that's when I saw it. The books had been hiding something. Tucked into the gap between the credenza and the wall, shielded from casual view, was a stack of heavy, cream-colored envelopes. They weren't business correspondence. They were too thick, the paper too textured, cotton rag, the kind that feels like fabric between your fingers. I should have looked away. I should have pushed the monographs back into place, grabbed the client file, and retreated to the safety of the studio floor. But the anomaly held me. Eloise didn't do clutter. She didn't do hidden stacks. Everything in her life was labeled, filed, and digitized. This was a glitch in the system, a variable that didn't fit the equation. I reached out. It wasn't a decision so much as a magnetic reaction. My fingers brushed the top envelope. It wasn't sealed. The flap was tucked in, casual, invitation only. I told myself I was looking for a project note. Maybe these were personal sketches for the museum. Maybe these were confidential notes on the client's board of directors. I needed to know if there was sensitive information I should be aware of for the pitch. It was a lie, flimsy as tissue paper, but it was enough to get my hand to pull the letter free. The handwriting was hers, unmistakable. Sharp, angular, vertical strokes that looked like they were carved rather than written. But the ink wasn't her usual black. It was a deep, bruised violet. I glanced at the date in the corner, October 14th. My breath hitched. That wasn't a project deadline. That wasn't a board meeting. I stared at the numbers, the memory slotting into place with the precision of a locking mechanism. October 14th was the day of the chaotic site visit to the waterfront project, the day the structural engineer had quit, and I had stepped in to manage the crisis while Eloise watched from the perimeter. I unfolded the paper. I expected a critique. I expected a list of my failures or a clinical assessment of the project's risks. I didn't expect the prose to be so visceral. She stood in the mud for 4 hours, the letter began. No salutation. The wind was tearing the plans out of the foreman's hands, but she didn't flinch. I watched the way she anchored herself against the chaos. Most people shrink when the pressure drops. She expands. It is terrifying to watch. It is the only thing I wanted to look at. The world tilted on its axis. I gripped the edge of the marble desk to steady myself. This wasn't about the building. This was about me. I scanned down the page, my eyes devouring the words, the professional distance I had cultivated for 2 years evaporating instantly. "She has this habit when she's thinking," the letter continued, the pen strokes heavier now, darker. "She traces the line of her own jaw with her thumb, a subconscious check of her own structure. I caught myself mirroring the motion in the meeting today. I wanted to know if her skin felt as cool as she pretends to be." My hand flew to my face. My thumb was resting exactly there, on the line of my jaw. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. She hadn't been ignoring me. She hadn't been looking through me to the blueprints on the wall. She had been watching. She had been cataloging me with the same obsessive, granular detail she applied to her skyscrapers. The silence of the office was no longer empty. It was screaming. I turned the page, my fingers leaving faint, damp marks on the heavy cotton stock. The next letter was dated from a month ago, the night we stayed until 3 a.m. finalizing the Tokyo proposal. I remembered that night as a grueling marathon of silence and caffeine. Eloise had sat at the drafting table, back rigid, red pen slashing through my concepts with brutal efficiency. I had felt small, inadequate, fighting to keep my eyes open. But here, in violet ink, the narrative was completely different. "She is exhausted," Eloise had written. "I can see the tremor in her left hand when she reaches for the mouse. But she doesn't stop. There is a relentless quality to her focus that I find intoxicating. Most people break. They compromise the design to save themselves. She sacrifices herself to save the design." I wanted to tell her to go home. I wanted to drive her home. I wanted to lay her down on a surface that wasn't covered in blueprints and watch that tension finally leave her shoulders. But I just asked her for the elevation data instead. I am a coward hiding behind a title. I felt a flush rise up my neck, hot and prickly. The discrepancy was dizzying. I looked at the empty chair behind the desk. I had always assumed her silence was disapproval. Now I realized it was restraint. She wasn't cold. She was frozen, holding herself in check with the same rigorous discipline she applied to steel and glass. I picked up another envelope. The date was from the annual gala, 3 months ago. I had worn a green dress I felt unsure about, too soft for a room full of sharp angles. Eloise had barely looked at me. "Green," the letter started. She walked in, and the room effectively ceased to exist. The structural integrity of my patience is failing. I watched her talk to the client from the transit authority. I watched the way she tilted her head, the cadence of her laugh. It's a lower register than her speaking voice, warmer, like wood resolving against stone. I caught myself tracking her movement through the crowd like a radar system locked onto a target. When she brushed past me at the bar, the proximity was almost violent. I smelled her perfume, sandalwood and something floral like jasmine. I had to leave because the urge to reach out and touch the bare skin of her arm was a physical ache. I lowered the letter, my heart hammering. The cadence of my laugh, the structural integrity of her patience. The language was so her, but applied to me. It was like finding a blueprint of my own soul drawn by the one person I thought didn't know I existed. For 2 years, I had curated myself for her, trying to be the perfect machine she seemed to require. And all that time, she hadn't been looking for a machine. She had been obsessed with the flaws, the humanity, the things I tried to hide. It was a violation, and yet I didn't feel violated. I felt recognized. I felt a sudden retroactive vertigo, replaying every meeting. The times she stood too close, the times her gaze lingered on my hands. The tension I had interpreted as stress, was it desire? Was the air in this office always this thick? I looked down at the scattered envelopes. There were dozens of them. A chronicle of obsession, a manifesto of longing written by a woman who built skyscrapers but couldn't build a bridge across the 4 feet of desk space between us. I reached for one more, my greed for her words overtaking my fear. But then I heard it. Sharp, rhythmic, percussive. Click, click, click. Heels on polished concrete. The sound was coming from the corridor. It wasn't the heavy tread of security. It was a stride I knew as well as my own heartbeat. It was cutting a straight line through the open-plan studio, heading directly for the corner office. Heading toward me. I froze, the letter in my hand suddenly weighing 1,000 pounds. The papers on the credenza were still a mess. The footsteps grew louder, closer, echoing off the glass walls. Click, click, click. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded my system. There was nowhere to hide. The office was a glass box. The only exit was the door she was walking toward. I shoved the letter I was holding back toward the stack, but my hands were clumsy now. The envelope fluttered to the floor. Click. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. I saw the shadow stretch under the frosted glass door. I saw the handle turn. The door opened. The door didn't just open. It dismantled the room's atmosphere. The air pressure seemed to drop instantly, sucking the oxygen out of the space and replacing it with a cold, crystalline tension. Eloise stood in the threshold, framed by the darkness of the outer corridor. She was wearing a trench coat over her suit, belted tight, the collar turned up against the wind I hadn't felt all day. She looked like a noir detective arriving at a crime scene, only the crime was her own vulnerability, and I was the one holding the smoking gun. My body reacted before my brain could process the logistics of disaster. The adrenaline hit me like a chemical burn, starting in my chest and flashing out to my fingertips. I went rigid, the letter in my hand crumpling slightly, a sharp, crinkling sound that seemed deafening in the quiet. I couldn't move. I couldn't hide the evidence. The letters were splayed across the credenza like an autopsy of her heart, and the one on the floor lay between us like a dropped gauntlet. Escape wasn't just impossible. The concept of elsewhere had ceased to exist. There was only this room, this light, and the terrifying geometry of her gaze. She didn't gasp. She didn't yell. She didn't even blink. Her eyes, usually the color of steel, looked darker tonight, dilated. She tracked the scene with a terrifying clinical efficiency. First, she looked at the scattered monographs. Then, her gaze slid to the cream envelopes on the black marble. Finally, she looked at the letter in my hand, and then, slowly, inevitably, up to my face. I expected rage. I braced myself for the icy, professional evisceration she was famous for, the kind that left junior architects weeping in the stairwell. But what I saw was worse. Her shoulders dropped, just a fraction of an inch. The tension that held her upright, that famous, unbreakable posture, seemed to soften. She didn't look furious. She looked resigned. She looked like a structural engineer watching a bridge collapse after knowing for years that the stress fractures were there. It was the calm of someone who had been waiting for the catastrophe to finally happen. She stepped into the office. The sound of her heel on the rug was muffled, a dull thud compared to the sharp click on the concrete outside. She didn't rush to snatch the letters. She didn't try to cover the mess. She simply turned around, placed her hand on the brushed steel lever of the door, and pushed it shut. Click. Then, with a deliberate, slow twist of her wrist, she turned the thumb lock. Snick. The sound was final. It severed us from the firm, from the deadline, from the rules of employment that had governed every interaction we'd ever had. We were no longer boss and subordinate. We were two people trapped in a glass box with a truth that was too big to fit inside. She turned back to face me, leaning slightly against the door, her hands deep in the pockets of her coat. She looked exhausted, the kind of bone-deep weariness that comes from holding up the sky for too long. The silence between us was heavy, viscous. It hummed with the server noise and the pounding of my own blood in my ears. I wanted to speak, to stammer out an excuse about the client file, but the words died in my throat. The lie would be an insult to the intelligence she had praised in the very letter I was holding. "I suppose," she said finally, her voice low and devoid of its usual sharp projection. That you have questions regarding the data you've uncovered. It was so her. Even now, stripped bare, she retreated into the language of analysis. She was trying to frame her own desire as a data set, something to be managed and filed away. I wasn't looking for them, I said. My voice sounded foreign, steadier than I felt, scraping against the silence. I knocked the books over. I was looking for the ocular profile. The ocular profile is on the server, she said, her eyes not leaving mine. I digitized it at 6. I forgot to tell you. You forgot. I repeated the words. Eloise Vance didn't forget things. She didn't make errors. Unless she was distracted. Unless the structural integrity of her focus was failing. I forgot, she admitted. She took a step toward the desk, stopping 5 feet away. She didn't ask for the letter back. She just looked at it, clutched in my hand. Well, you have the evidence. You've read the analysis. What is your assessment? She was giving me an out. She was treating this like a design review, inviting me to critique the work so she could maintain the distance of the creator. She wanted me to apologize, to backtrack, to pretend I hadn't seen the raw, beating heart she had hidden behind the velvet covers of her notebooks. She wanted me to give her back the power. I looked at the letter again. I wanted to lay her down on the surface that wasn't covered in blueprints. I looked up at her. The fear was still there, vibrating under my skin. But something else was rising to meet it, a fierce, hot defiance. I wasn't going to let her retreat into the safety of being my boss. Not after I knew how she watched me when the room was crowded. Not after I knew she tracked the movement of my hands. My assessment, I said, taking a step forward, closing the distance she had always maintained, is that you're a hypocrite. Her eyes widened, just slightly. The shock of the word cracked the mask. You demand total transparency from every client, I said, my voice gaining strength. You fire consultants who hide structural flaws, and yet you've been writing this, I lifted the letter, shaking it slightly, for months. You've been watching me, analyzing me, wanting me. I didn't apologize. I didn't offer the letter back. I held it, like a warrant. You don't get to grade my assessment, Eloise, I said, using her first name without the title for the first time in 2 years. Because for the first time since I started working here, I'm not the one being evaluated. Eloise's reaction to her first name being used was subtle but seismic. Her jaw tightened, that specific muscle feathering near her ear that I had learned to interpret as a storm warning. She didn't shout, she didn't explode. She did something far more intimidating. She became the architect again. She straightened her spine, pulling the trench coat tighter around herself as if armoring up against a hostile environment. She walked past me, moving behind the massive black marble desk. It was a tactical retreat. She was putting the fortress back between us, reestablishing the geography of authority. You are crossing a line, she said. Her voice was ice, stripped of the resignation from a moment ago. It was the voice that negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts. Those documents are personal property. You have violated my privacy, and now you are attempting to leverage that violation. Put the letter on the desk. Leave the office. We will discuss your employment status in the morning. It was a terrifying performance. A week ago, it would have worked. A week ago, I would have apologized, placed the letter down with trembling hands, and fled, grateful to keep my job. But the paper in my hand was heavy with a different truth. I looked down at it, then back at her. She was gripping the edge of the desk so hard her knuckles were white, a structural stress point she couldn't hide. No, I said. The word hung in the air, simple and absolute. Eloise blinked. Excuse me? I said no. I didn't shout. I just let the refusal sit there, occupying the space she usually filled with commands. You don't get to threaten my job because you got caught feeling something. You don't get to retreat behind the boss persona when you've spent months undressing me with your words. I have never, she started, the denial automatic. Don't, I cut her off. I lifted the letter again, finding the passage that had made my breath catch earlier. October 4th, the Transit Authority pitch. I met her eyes, daring her to look away. She didn't. You wrote, she speaks and the room reorients around her. I find myself agreeing with her strategy not because it is sound, though it is, but because I want to give her whatever she asks for. It is dangerous. She is a hairline fracture in my foundation, and every day she widens. I lowered the paper. Is that what this is about? You're afraid I'm going to break you? Eloise stared at me. The silence stretched, thin and high-pitched. The air conditioning hummed, oblivious to the devastation happening in the corner office. I saw the calculation behind her eyes. She was running the simulations, looking for the outcome where she won, where she stayed safe, where she remained the untouchable Eloise Vance. But she couldn't find it. I saw the moment the calculation failed. Her shoulders sank. The fierce, protective glare dimmed, replaced by something raw and terrified. The power in the room shifted physically. It flowed away from the woman behind the desk and settled around me. I wasn't the subordinate anymore. I was the one holding the knowledge. I was the one who knew the secret code to the vault. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she whispered. The admission was shocking in its quietness. It was supposed to be contained, a variable I could isolate. I'm not a variable, Eloise, I said softly. I'm the person who makes your coffee. I'm the person who stays here until midnight because I thought I was the one who was obsessed. She looked up sharply at that. I thought I was the only one, I admitted. I thought I was projecting, that I was imagining the tension because I wanted it to be there. She laughed then, a dry, brittle sound that had no humor in it. Imagining it? My God. I have barely been able to breathe in this office for 6 months. Why do you think I keep the temperature so low? Why do you think I send you to site visits I could handle myself? She moved then. She pushed off the desk, abandoning the fortress. She walked around the edge of the marble slab, stepping into the open space of the room, the no man's land between us. She stopped, 3 feet away, close enough that I could smell the rain on her coat and the lingering scent of her anxiety. You aren't just a flaw in the system, she said, her voice regaining some strength, but deeper now, darker. You are the collapse. I built this firm on control, on precision. And you walk in here with your messy hair and your cadence, and you dismantle it without even trying. She gestured vaguely at the scattered letters. I wrote those to get it out of my system, to exercise you. It didn't work. The more I wrote, the more real it became. She looked at me, really looked at me, stripping away the last of the professional veneer. So, no, we are not discussing your employment status. We are discussing the fact that I am terrified of you. Because you are the only person in this city who sees me not as an architect, but as a woman who is starving. The word starving didn't just hang in the air. It seemed to consume the remaining oxygen in the room. It was a violent admission from a woman whose entire career was built on the concept of stability. Eloise Vance didn't starve. She acquired. She planned. She executed. To hear her admit to a lack, to a hollow space she couldn't fill with accolades or contracts, was like watching a load-bearing wall dissolve into dust. She looked away from me then, breaking the intensity of the stare for the first time. Her gaze drifted to the floor, to the single envelope that had fallen between us. The defiance that had flared up in her a moment ago seemed to burn out, leaving behind something ash-gray and exhausted. She brought a hand up to her face, pressing her palm against her forehead, shielding her eyes. It was a gesture of such profound human fatigue that it hurt to look at. The architect was gone. The boss was gone. There was only Eloise, standing in a wet trench coat, undone by her own confession. I thought if I wrote it down, she said, her voice muffled behind her hand, it would leave me. I thought I could purge the The distraction. Keep the work pure. She dropped her hand and looked at me, her eyes wet and furious with herself. But it didn't work. The ink just made it permanent. Every time you walked into a room, I didn't see my senior associate. I saw the way light caught the curve of your neck. I saw the way you hold a pen when you're frustrated. It became a noise I couldn't silence. You call it noise, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The anger I had felt earlier was evaporating, replaced by a heavy, thrumming heat that started in my chest and moved outward. You call it a distraction. It is a distraction, she insisted, though the fight was draining out of her tone. It is a liability. I am your employer. This dynamic, it's a violation of every protocol I've written. It's messy. It's unprofessional. It's reciprocal, I finished for her. The word stopped her. She froze. Her lips parted around an argument she never got to make. The silence that followed wasn't tense. It was suspended, like the moment before a roller coaster drops. You think you're the only one who's been watching? I took another step forward. The safety of the 3-foot gap was gone. I was in her orbit now. You think I stayed here until midnight every night for 2 years because I love zoning laws? You think I memorized your coffee order because I care about caffeine? Eloise stared at me, her chest rising and falling rapidly beneath the heavy wool of her coat. I assumed ambition. I assumed you wanted the career. I do want the career, I said, and the truth felt like a weight lifting off my tongue. But I wanted you to see me get it. I wanted to impress you, not the firm. You. I watched the realization hit her. It wasn't a sudden dawn. It was a slow, terrifying sunrise. She realized that the glass wall she thought she was observing me through had been a mirror all along. I hadn't been the oblivious subject of her study. I had been studying back. I know you get a migraine when the barometer drops, I said, cataloging my own list of observations, offering them up like an equal exchange for her letters. I know you switch to the silver fountain pen when you're signing something you don't agree with. I know you hate the sound of the elevator ding, so you brace yourself right before the doors open. I know the cadence of your silence, Eloise. I know the difference between when you're thinking and when you're looking at me. She made a small, choked sound, half gasp, half sob. The confession stripped away the last vestige of the corporate hierarchy. We weren't standing in her office anymore. We were standing in the wreckage of the boundaries we had both pretended to respect. The desk, the letters, the blueprints, they all faded into the background, irrelevant props in a play that had finished its run. You knew? She whispered. You knew I was looking? I felt it, I said, every time. It felt like a physical weight. And I liked it. The admission hung between us, raw and undeniable. The distance between us had shrunk to inches. I could see the fine grain of her skin, the faint flush rising on her cheeks, the way her pupils had blown wide, swallowing the steel gray irises. The air between us was no longer empty space. It was a magnetic field, charged and humming with 2 years of repression finally finding a conduit. I should fire you, she breathed, but she didn't move away. She leaned in, drawn by the same gravity that was pulling me. You can't, I whispered back. You'd starve. The tension snapped. It wasn't a decision anymore. It was a collision course. The structural failure was complete. The walls were down, the roof was gone, and all that was left was the terrifying, electric open air between 2 women who had stopped pretending. The distance between us had been a battlefield for 2 years, a no man's land of professional courtesy and unspoken tension. Now, that distance was gone, obliterated by the truth lying scattered on the floor. But closing the gap was only the first step. Crossing the threshold of touch was entirely different. It felt illicit, dangerous, like reaching through the safety railing of a balcony to grab a live wire. Eloise moved first. It wasn't a confident movement. It wasn't the decisive, sweeping gesture she used to dismiss contractors or approve blueprints. It was hesitant, almost trembling. Her hand came up slowly, fighting the gravity of a decade of self-imposed discipline. When her fingers finally brushed my jaw, the contact was shocking. Her skin was cold from the night air, carrying the chill of the rain outside, while my face was burning, flushed with the heat of the argument and the adrenaline of the discovery. The contrast was violent, fire and ice meeting on the line of my jawbone. She traced the path she had written about in her letters, her thumb finding the pulse point just below my ear. She wasn't just touching me, she was verifying the data. She was checking if the reality matched the obsession she had cataloged in violet ink. I stopped breathing. The sensation was overwhelming, grounding me in the room in a way that felt terrifyingly permanent. I could smell the damp wool of her trench coat, the sharp metallic tang of the rain, and beneath it all, the warm, familiar scent of sandalwood that I had chased through the office corridors for months. "You're warm," she whispered, her voice sounding wrecked, stripped of its usual polish. Her eyes were searching mine, looking for rejection, looking for the moment I would realize this was a mistake and pull away. But I didn't pull away. I leaned into her touch. I let the weight of her hand anchor me. And then, I changed the dynamic. I didn't just accept the contact. I reciprocated it. I reached up, my own hand moving with a confidence I hadn't known I possessed until this exact second. I took hold of the lapel of her trench coat, the heavy, wet fabric bunching in my fist. I wasn't her associate anymore. I wasn't the junior architect waiting for approval. I was the woman who knew her secrets. "I'm not a drawing, Eloise," I said softly, my voice steady in the quiet room. "You don't have to study me from a distance anymore." I pulled her closer, just an inch, but it was enough to shatter the last of her reserve. Her breath hitched, a sharp intake of air that sounded like a sob. I moved my hand from her lapel to her waist, finding the knot of the belt that held the coat closed. It was a barrier, a piece of armor she had wrapped herself in before storming in here to fire me. I tugged the knot loose. The heavy coat fell open, revealing the tailored suit underneath, revealing the woman who had been hiding inside the architect. She didn't stop me. She let me dismantle her defenses, her eyes locked on my mouth, her expression one of agonizing, hungry patience. It was a negotiation, silent and high stakes, and we had both just agreed to the terms. I stepped into the space the open coat created. We were chest to chest now, the heat radiating between us, undeniable. I tilted my head back, looking up at her, and saw the exact moment she stopped thinking and started feeling. Her gaze dropped to my lips, and the structural integrity she had written about finally, beautifully, failed. The kiss wasn't frantic. It wasn't the chaotic, clashing collision of a movie romance. It was heavy. It was the weight of 2 years of silence collapsing all at once. It tasted of the espresso she drank like water, and the expensive matte lipstick she wore like war paint. It tasted of repression and relief. Her mouth was soft, urgent, moving against mine with a desperation that made my knees weak. She made a low sound in her throat, a vibration I felt against my own lips. And her hands moved from my face to tangle in my hair, gripping tight, holding me in place as if she was afraid I might vanish if she let go. I wrapped my arms around her waist, pulling her flush against me, needing to feel the solidity of her, to prove that this wasn't just another fantasy I'd had at 2 a.m. over a drafting table. This was real. The friction of the wool coat against my arms, the silk of her blouse under my hands, the rapid, hammering rhythm of her heart against my chest. It was all real. We kissed until the air in my lungs burned, until the office, the deadline, and the city outside ceased to exist. There was only the cadence of our breathing and the friction of our bodies finally occupying the same space. When we broke apart, gasping, we didn't step back. We couldn't. The gravity was too strong. Eloise rested her forehead against mine, her eyes closed, her hands still woven into my hair. She was trembling, a fine, continuous shudder running through her frame. "I should have done that," she whispered, her voice rough. "The day I interviewed you, you would have scared me away," I murmured, running my hands up her spine, feeling the tension still knotted there. "I'm scaring myself now," she admitted, opening her eyes. They were dark, dilated, and completely unguarded. I took her hand, lacing my fingers through hers. The fit was perfect, architectural, precise. "Come here," I said, tugging her gently. I led her away from the desk, away from the scattered letters and the evidence of our professional lives. I pulled her toward the low leather sofa in the corner of the office, the one reserved for VIP clients and exhausted naps during charrettes. The transition from the vertical tension of standing to the intimate potential of sitting felt significant. We were moving away from the confrontation and into the aftermath. She followed me without hesitation, shedding the wet trench coat and letting it fall to the floor in a heap of dark wool. We sat down, the leather creaking beneath us, and the silence of the high-rise settled back over the room. But it wasn't the cold silence of before. It was warm, shared, and heavy with the promise of everything we were about to discover. The leather of the sofa was cool against my back, a sharp contrast to the fever heat radiating off Eloise. In the dim light of the office, stripped of the overhead fluorescence and the pretenses of the workday, the space felt less like a place of business and more like a capsule suspended in the night sky. We were 40 floors up, insulated by glass and steel, but for the first time, the architecture didn't feel rigid. It felt fluid, reshaping itself around the sudden, terrifying intimacy of two bodies finally acknowledging they occupied the same orbit. Eloise hovered over me for a moment, her hands bracing on the cushions on either side of my head. The silhouette of her shoulders, usually so squared and formidable in her blazers, looked softer now in just the silk blouse. I could see the rapid rise and fall of her chest, the way the fabric strained slightly with each breath. She was hesitating, not out of reluctance, but out of a kind of reverence. It was the hesitation of an architect standing before a site they had only ever seen on paper, finally about to break ground. "I don't know the protocol for this," she murmured, a ghost of a laugh escaping her lips. It was self-deprecating, vulnerable. "I don't have a workflow for us." "Good," I whispered, reaching up to trace the line of buttons on her blouse. "We're off the clock. No workflows, no deliverables." My fingers brushed the silk, cool and slippery, and I felt her shiver. It was a reaction so immediate, so unhidden, that it made my own pulse jump. This was the woman who negotiated million-dollar contracts without blinking, now trembling because my knuckles grazed her sternum. I undid the first button, then the second. The movement was slow, deliberate, a drafting of new lines. I wasn't unmaking her. I was revealing the structure underneath. When my hands slipped inside the fabric to touch the warm skin of her waist, she let out a sound that was half sigh, half whimper. It was the sound of a load-bearing wall finally being allowed to rest. The scent of her was overwhelming now. Not just the sandalwood perfume that lingered in the elevators, but the underlying human scent of her skin. It was salt and warmth and something uniquely Eloise, a biological signature I realized I had been trying to decode for 2 years. She collapsed the distance between us, her mouth finding mine again, but this time the urgency had shifted. It wasn't the desperate collision of the doorway. It was an exploration. Her hands were everywhere, mapping the tension in my shoulders, the curve of my waist, the heat of my neck. It felt like she was fact-checking her own letters, verifying that the cadence of my pulse matched the data she had obsessively recorded. I remembered the phrase from the second letter. I wanted to know if her skin felt as cool as she pretends to be. I pulled her closer, answering the question with the heat of my own body. There was no coolness here. There was only friction. The friction of silk against cotton, of skin against skin, of authority dissolving into desire. Every touch felt heavy with the weight of the words we had just read. When her thumb brushed my lower lip, I didn't just feel a touch. I felt the months of her staring at me across the conference table, wanting to do exactly this. The physical sensation was amplified by the emotional context, creating a feedback loop that made my head spin. We weren't boss and employee. That hierarchy had been incinerated the moment the lock clicked shut. In this space, on this sofa, we were equals. Actually, it was more complex than that. I realized with a jolt that I held a different kind of power. She was unspooling in my arms, her composure fracturing into raw need. I wasn't just the object of her desire, I was the architect of her unraveling. I guided her, my hands steady where hers were shaking, setting a pace that was slow, deep, and undeniable. Eloise, I said her name against her skin, tasting the salt at the base of her throat. She shuddered, her fingers gripping my arms tight enough to bruise. Don't stop, she whispered, the command stripped of all authority, left only with pleading. God, don't stop. The room narrowed down to the sound of our breathing and the rustle of clothes. The hum of the servers, the distant city traffic, the impending deadline, it all became white noise. The only reality was the pressure of her hips, the softness of her hair falling around us like a curtain, and the terrifying, wonderful realization that the woman I had admired from a distance was burning up in my arms. We moved together with a rhythm that felt instinctive, a cadence we had apparently been rehearsing in our heads for months without knowing it. It was a conversation without words, a negotiation of pleasure where the only currency was honesty. There was no posturing here, no strategy, just the raw, unvarnished truth of two women who had been starving for each other in the same glass box, finally breaking the glass. As the intensity peaked and then slowly ebbed, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a heavy, golden warmth. We lay tangled together, limbs heavy, the silence of the office returning, but changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full. The air felt charged, ionized by what had just happened. Eloise rested her head on my shoulder, her breathing slowly syncing with mine. Her hand rested flat over my heart, not checking the time, not checking a device, just feeling the beat. The boss was gone. In her place was just a woman, soft and exhausted, who had finally found a place to rest her head that wasn't a desk. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that the letters on the floor were no longer a secret diary. They were a prologue. We had just written the first chapter of the real story. Dawn didn't break gently over Chicago. It reconstructed the city with brutal geometric efficiency. The light that flooded the 42nd floor wasn't the soft golden glow of a romance novel. It was a cold, hard blue that sharpened every edge in the office, turning the glass walls from mirrors back into windows. The transition was jarring. One minute, we were suspended in a timeless, dark capsule of intimacy. The next, the sun was exposing the dust motes dancing in the air and the reality of the 8 a.m. deadline. We reassembled ourselves in the quiet that precedes the morning rush. There is a specific, surreal intimacy to dressing in an office while the rest of the city is waking up. It felt illicit, yet strangely domestic. I watched Eloise button her silk blouse, her fingers moving with the same precise dexterity she used to sketch floor plans. She didn't rush. She didn't look ashamed. She looked like someone who had finally slept after a week of insomnia. She caught my reflection in the glass as I straightened my own blazer, and for a moment, her hands paused. She didn't smile. Eloise Vance didn't smile while fastening a cuff, but her eyes softened, the steel gray warming into something that looked dangerously like contentment. The office looked exactly as it had 24 hours ago, yet the context had been rewritten entirely. The black marble desk was no longer a barricade, it was just furniture. The blueprints were just paper. The scattered cream envelopes, however, remained the focal point of the room. They lay on the rug and the credenza, a physical map of the night's demolition. I watched her walk over to them. She knelt, the movement fluid, and began to gather them up. She didn't scramble to hide them. She stacked them neatly, tapping the edges against the floor to align them, treating the evidence of her obsession with the same respect she gave a contract. She stood up and placed the stack in the top drawer of her desk. She didn't lock it. She looked at me, her hand lingering on the handle. "The ocular pitch," she said, her voice regaining its professional cadence, though it sat an octave lower than usual, rougher. "The client wants a monument. I designed a sanctuary. Do you think I missed the mark?" It was the first time in 2 years she had asked me for a critique before the presentation, not after. She wasn't testing me. She was consulting me. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had leveled. "You didn't design a sanctuary," I said, walking over to the drafting table where the main render sat. "You designed a fortress that looks like a sanctuary. It's protective. That's why they'll hire you. They're scared of the exposure, and you gave them walls made of light." Eloise looked at the drawing, then at me. A slow, genuine smile, rare and terrifyingly beautiful, broke across her face. "A fortress made of light," she repeated. "Yes, that is exactly it." She checked her watch. The gesture was automatic, but the panic wasn't there. "We have an hour before the team arrives. We need coffee. Real coffee, not the sludge from the break room." "I'll go," I said, the old habit kicking in. "No," she corrected, picking up her trench coat and draping it over her arm. "We'll go. I need to walk. I need to feel the air." We walked to the elevator together. We didn't hold hands. The building had cameras, and we were both professionals who understood the difference between a secret and a scandal. But the space between us was charged. We stood shoulder to shoulder as the numbers counted down. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was a structural component of us, a shared understanding that didn't need to be spoken. When the doors opened to the lobby, we stepped out into the morning rush, not as boss and subordinate, but as two women sharing a gravity that the rest of the world couldn't see. The revolving doors spun us out into the cold morning air, the noise of the city rushing in to fill the quiet. I glanced back at the glass tower, then at Eloise walking beside me. I realized the job wasn't just about building structures anymore. It was about living in them. If you want to see how we navigate the blueprints of this new reality, subscribe to follow the rest of the story.